Welcome to Flex Perspectives, where I interview the thought leaders, innovators, and executives shaping the future of flexible work. Flex Perspectives is brought to you by the Flex Index, the world's most robust source for full-time, hybrid, and remote work requirements. The Flex Index represents more than 4,000 companies, 25,000 office locations, and 100 million people. It's a great place to start if you're looking for your next flexible work career opportunity. Today, my guest is Nick Bloom. Nick is an economics professor at Stanford University and one of the foremost thought leaders, speakers, and researchers on remote work. He's been recognized everywhere from the Forbes Future of Work 50 to the Bloomberg 50 Most Influential. Today, we're going to gaze into Nick's crystal ball. We'll discuss Nick's predictions for the future of remote work, whether fully remote or hybrid will be more common, and how many days per week we'll spend in the office in 2030. Hello, and welcome to the Flex Perspectives podcast. I'm Rob Sadow, CEO and co-founder at Scoop. Today, we have Nick Bloom, the oracle of flexible work himself, on the podcast. Nick is a Stanford economics professor, the founder of WFHresearch.com, and was recognized on the Forbes Future of Work 50. Nick, welcome, and thank you so much for coming.
Rob, thanks very much for having me on.
So, Nick, you started studying remote work way before the pandemic. What initially got you so interested in this topic?
It's a good question. So yes, I did start about 20 years ago. Back in 2003 was the first time I collected data. A couple of things really. I was very interested in management practices. I'd actually worked at McKinsey, and you saw clients that were well managed and badly managed, and I thought this matters. We should get data. But one element of this was obviously kind of what I call being nice to people practices. Can you maternity leave, paternity leave? And one of those is work from home. The other angle was more just a personal angle. I'm one of 4 kids. Both my parents worked full-time when I was being brought up, and they had to work from home, in the school holidays. And it wasn't great for them. And I was kind of interested what the impact on them and how it was going to evolve going forward.
Got it. You're actually the second person who is either at McKinsey or past McKinsey alumni, I guess, that's been on. As you know, I worked at Bain for a while, so I'm going to have to find some Bain people, I think, to balance this out a little bit in future episodes. One of the things, Nick, I find so interesting about your work is that you've got a bunch of different sources that you use to triangulate and help you think about trends. I know you do survey work at WFH Research. You also talk to lots of folks at large enterprises to understand trends. What are all the different inputs that you're using, and how do you pull those things together to help shape your perspective on where we're headed on this topic?
Great. So there's kind of 2 broad sources. So on the one hand, there is basically talking to people. So I talked to just a huge range of individuals, a lot of companies, law firms, tech companies, but then things like my local city council, San Francisco City Council, hospitals, the World Bank, all kinds of different organizations, quite a lot of property management companies, actually. So that kind of gets a lot of anecdotes, but over time, it's more than just anecdotes, it's a sense of where things are. And it also raises questions. So that often say after the 3rd or 4th person has said, this is the trends we're seeing, you're like, okay, there really has to be something in this. And then the other side is the kind of dry data, which is surveys, administrative data, actually a lot of working with companies. So just this morning, I'm working with MasterCard, looking at, transaction data in various cities around the world, talking to a property company at office vacancy rates. So collectively, they're like fantastic. Individually, one's a bit dry and the other's a bit anecdotally, but I try and bring them together to weave a story as I see of how work from home is evolving.
Got it. So what I want to do, and we'll spend a good chunk of the time today doing, is taking those different inputs that you have and staring into the Nick Bloom crystal ball, if you will, in terms of where we're headed. So I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions around what do you think flexible work and the future of work is going to look like 5 or 10 years down the road, and very interested to hear your perspective on it. Let's start with different types of models. If you fast forward to 2030, what do you think is going to be more common? Are we going to see more hybrid work, or do you think we're going to see more fully remote work?
So I think for smaller companies, particularly startups, you could see a bunch that are fully remote. If I'm like a tech or a finance company or maybe business services or accounting, I may just entirely get rid of the office. I maybe have 10, 20 people. Once you're getting up to kind of 50, maybe 100 plus companies upwards, which there aren't that many, but they employ most Americans. So, 90% of Americans work in companies with 100 or more employees. There, we're really going to have a mix of 3 different modes. So take Stanford University, I know well. So Stanford University, we have, 15,000 employees. And I think about 5,000 are fully in person. So, food service, security, janitorial, transport, etc. They can't do it remotely. So there's that group. There's another group, people like me, probably most listeners, university grads. Those folks are hybrid. They will increasingly, I think, they're like harmonizing in this team by team or overall on something like Tuesday to Thursday in the office, Monday, Friday at home. And then there's a third group that are fully remote. The path of the fully remote folks is in some ways the least clear to me, because on the one hand, you think, well, definitely there's going to be a lot of fully remote, that's growing. Some of that, though, is going to move overseas. I talk to a lot of CEOs, execs that say, look, if someone can be doing it fully remote, we may just move it to Mexico or Colombia or, Bulgaria or wherever. And some of it by 2030 may be replaced by AI, because if you look at the kind of things that are done fully remote in large organizations, most of it by person hours is like payments processing, payroll, HR, benefits, IT support. So that's the bit I'm actually least clear on. That could actually oddly shrink, at least as a share of US workers.
It's super interesting. I want to talk about first, a couple of things you mentioned there, but I want to talk first about the size point. Why is it that you think of that? You said 50 to 100 employees or more. Why do you think it starts to tip into hybrid? Or something about the dynamics of those organization or what it means to collaborate at that size where you think that model starts to become more important?
It's a good question. So in the Flex Index, as you've seen, smaller, younger companies tend to be much more remote than larger, older companies. And, I've seen that a bit, but not as, you have better data on this. I've seen it in other data, so I totally believe it. One story is small companies, if you've got 5-10 people, they maybe are all doing pretty similar roles. And if they're in a startup, they're probably all college grads. Half of them probably have PhD types. So, there are no janitorial. That's things outsourced. They're really, you're in a, if you're in an office, you're kind of renting space. So a lot of small startups, they do meet in person, but they do it, as you say, there's only 10 of you. So you say, look, we're going to meet in Phoenix, next month, and we're going to do it for 3 days. So there's maybe more flexibility. It's easier to ad hoc pull people in and out. I mean, I could ask you how Scoop does. I'm sure that you see your coworkers. You probably, you don't have offices, right?
Well, we have an office in San Francisco. So we've got employees across the U.S., folks that are near offices will go in, and we'll also do shared spaces. We have something through Tishman Speyer called Studio by Tishman Speyer, where people will hop in. But to your point, we're on the smaller side, right, relative to some of the larger companies, and we're hybrid, but we're employees' choice hybrid, where employees can choose how often to go in.
So the question is whether these small startups, as they grow, so, as Scoop hits 50, 100, 200 employees, when you become the next big Walmart, who knows where you head, but as firms get bigger, what do they look like? And I suspect there'll be some combination of what today's big firms look like, which is more in person, but there's some combination of also keeping their roots. So I think one of the forces driving rising levels of remote work going forwards is today's new young firms, which many of them are going to be tomorrow's, medium and larger firms, are very remote focused. It's interesting. When I talk to venture capitalists, a bunch of them do say, hey, look, we want to see firms when they hit 20, 25 people start to be slightly more in person. We think it's easier to make decisions faster. It's easier for mentoring, for training. But look, when they're starting off, we're fine. If there's like 3-5 people, it's okay as long as they're getting the stuff done. So I think age and size are the, as you see in the Flex Index, are the big determinants. And that's going to drive, this continuous evolution of lots of small remote firms. And as firms get bigger, they become, increasingly hybrid.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you're right on the mentorship piece, right? Because one of the things I do wonder is, as companies get larger, 25 to 50 to 100, the likelihood that you're starting to hire newer talent, fresh out of school, less potential on-the-job training, where being in person with somebody shoulder to shoulder, so to speak, can be more impactful. The other is I wonder if there's a real estate element to it and the ability to invest in real estate as an expense once you're kind of past the so to speak, binary phase where you're sure you're going to continue to be a company, so to speak, and you're not so cash strapped kind of month to month in terms of the way you operate.
I totally agree. The first one I'd never really thought of, but you're exactly right. If I look at my Stanford students, who they are applying to for, some are in full-time jobs, they tend to be bigger companies. They're the kind of places that are hiring often 20, 25-year-olds. And for that group, mentoring is absolutely critical. And we see in the data it's easier to do that in person. So you don't need to be 5 days a week, but it's really valuable. if you're hiring, Stanford students or whatever it is, folks in their 20s, for them to be able to come in 2-3 days a week. It's also true that small firms tend to have tighter finances. The other thing I think that's true about really small firms is a lot of those folks actually have another job. So if you look at a bunch of startups, there may be 5 people who are currently working, all doing something else, and are starting up their firm kind of on the side in the evenings and the weekends. And again, I think that's fine, as long as you're getting your main job done. There is no problem doing your start, rather than watching Netflix or playing golf, you're starting up a company in the weekend. And eventually, as it starts to take off, you drop out of your main job and that becomes your main job.
Yep. You said something really interesting before, too. I didn't want to lose it around what ends up happening with fully remote opportunities. Does that make it so that you're not competing with a global labor pool in terms of who else can potentially take that role, level of competition with AI over time? Talk a little bit more about that. How much of an impact do you think that's going to have on the number of fully remote opportunities, potentially or particularly in maybe higher cost of living, higher cost of talent type of locations?
Absolutely. So one just fact is, in May 2020, really the peak of the pandemic, about 50% of Americans were working fully remotely. So if you could do your job even horribly badly fully remotely, you were doing it. By now, it's dropped to about 10%. So there's an enormous fall. And that 40% of left fully remote have almost all gone into hybrid. So that's why hybrid's picked up a lot and fully remote's down. I think in the long run, I was, in fact, for everyone else, before the show started recording, we were discussing an anecdote. I had a CEO in my office last week who was saying that their associates were all asking to be fully remote. The CEO said, that's totally fine. You can all be fully remote. He said he told them, you can all be fully remote as long as you're fine with us advertising this role globally, because of course, if you're fully remote, anyone can do this role. And at that point, apparently all the associates were like, oh, no, actually we changed our mind. We want to be hybrid. So it's very clear, if your job is fully remote, it is possible for anyone to do this. Even, someone in Colombia can fly into the US once every other month, maybe, meet for a few days or do it fully remotely. The other risk, really less in 23, but by 2025, 2030, is AI. If you look at what jobs are mostly fully remote now, they're mostly, they're not so creative. A lot of them are like HR, payroll, tech support, and that stuff's going to be, maybe not now, but if you look at ChatGPT, we're on ChatGPT, 4? By the time we get to ChatGPT 9 in 2030 or whatever it is, this thing's going to be incredible. So I think we're going to see a future of probably, in the US at least, mostly either in person or hybrid. And I think fully remote is going to be the segment that's going to shrink. But it will be there globally or in AI, but it's not going to be so much in the US. And as you say, places like New York and San Francisco, if you're working fully remote there, you probably have another reason, like you have a spouse that has an in-person job or you're, living with your parents.
Makes sense. So if you think hybrid is going to be, let's say, the dominant model in an area like the United States, for example, over time, you and I have spent a lot of time collaborating on the topic of hybrid, and we generally talk about 2 dominant types, if you will, right? There's employees' choice, which is hybrid, but employees choose whether and how often to go into an office. And then there's the structured hybrid models where the employer communicates some expectation around time spent in the office, could be minimum days or specific days, minimum percentage of the time, for example, that employees are supposed to be there. If you were to look out 5-10 years from now, which of those models do you think is going to be most common, the employee's choice or structured hybrid?
I think it will be structured, but maybe there's a little bit of messaging around this. So it's kind of like as a parent, when you tell your, maybe we'll have kids, for anyone who have kids, you tell your 8-year-old it's time to go to bed, but you can choose. You can go to bed at 8 or 10 past 8. And it's like this kind of, some extent, it's not clear how real that choice is. The reason I raise this is no one really wants to come in the office on Friday. So Friday's kind of a work from home day pretty much everywhere. So then what about, you see that the Flex Index data, Monday is often the next most popular. So if you're on a schedule where employees are coming in 3 days a week, but you tell them you choose, it's a pretty, 70-80% of employees are going to choose Tuesday to Thursday. If you're a team manager or a firm, what you may say is, why don't we vote? And then whatever gets the most votes, we're going to make sure everyone does it. So if you go back to 2019, it would be unthinkable in 2019 if someone says, look, I'm going to work 50 hours a week, but rather than coming in Monday to Friday, 8 till 6, I'm going to come in Wednesday till Sunday, 8 till 6, because people say, well, like, no one's in the office on Saturday and Sunday. That doesn't make any sense. So post-pandemic, I think what's going to happen is you maybe have team by team, if it's very much a team-centered role, or maybe the whole company, where there's choice, but it's more like a democratic system or kind of top-down, where if I were a manager, I'd say, look, we know from the data that folks, the reason they come in is see their co-workers and work with each other. So as a group, it's up to you. We can discuss it as a group and decide, and I'm happy to have a vote. But at the end of it, whatever we collectively decide, everyone has to stick with it. So, Rob, even if you wanted to come in Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, the majority says Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we're all going to do it, because there's not much point you coming in on Friday, because, you're not there. And the reason this is important is when you talk to companies, they say there's a real cost for just 1 hour. So imagine there's 8 of you in a meeting. You're all there. You all do it in person. It works really great. Imagine now one person stays home. You've now got to connect to Zoom or Teams or whatever, and it becomes really irritating. And in fact, it doesn't even work that well having 7 in a room or 1 remotely, because those 7 are tiny heads and the person remotely tends to get left out. So then you say, well, look, why don't we all go and do it individually on our own laptops? And then the 7 say, what the heck am I doing coming into work to be, on a laptop for 3 hours just because Rob wants to stay home and watch the World Cup or whatever? So it turns out increasingly that firms are saying there is a big negative spillover if one person stays home. So it's kind of like driving on the left or the right side of the road. If 90% of people drive on the right and 10% on the left, is chaotic. So it's not obvious which is better or worse, but you just have to stick with the same system for everybody.
It's so interesting, though. It makes a lot of sense, right? It almost feels like this balancing, if you will, between what's the collective good versus what individually might be optimized for yourself in terms of what you'd like to do. And one of the things I wonder, and I'm curious your perspective on, is employers, I imagine, will try to steal talent from each other by offering more flexibility than the other company, right? But at the same time, there may be their own operating challenges or increased headache around coordination, the more flexibility you give. And so maybe in this economy, when the economy is not as strong, you might get one answer. I wonder in the future if you get a different answer in terms of how many companies maybe feel like they have to offer more flexibility to attract talent, even if it creates a little bit more coordination overhead.
You're exactly right. So as an economist, the free market is going to eventually sort this out. So imagine, I know in the data, I can just tell you big surveys from the US, that 20% of Americans want to be fully remote, 50% want to be hybrid, and it's the other way around. 20% want to be fully in person, 50% want to be hybrid, and 30% want to be fully remote. Now, most firms are going to hybrid. If you're that 30% that wants to be fully remote, you will potentially, a bunch of them would take a substantial pay cut to do that. So you could imagine firms that are created that say, look, we're going to pay you 10, 20% less, but you can work fully remotely for us. And there'll be a bunch of workers, millions of people across the country that want to do that. There'll be also firms that say, our thing is fully in person. Now, we're aware that most people don't want it, but there's 20% of Americans that really do. If you come work for us, you get to have your wish. And, there'll be people that will go work for them. It's kind of like geography. So, not everyone wants to live in New York. Not everyone wants to live in Cleveland. Not everyone wants to live in San Francisco. Firms spread out and they tap the people that want to live where they work. And so I think you're exactly right. The way to get flexibility is not have everyone do a different pattern within the same firm. It's for people to sort across companies. And that's really part of what the Great Resignation was. So there's this dimension of work called work from home that didn't really vary pre-pandemic, so it wasn't really a thing. And then suddenly in 21, 22, you now have this thing that varies and people are mismatched and they kind of are trading jobs to get to what they want.
So one thing I find really interesting about that, and I think you're right, like our Flex Index data, as you described, also shows that I think minimum days per week is starting to become the most popular structured hybrid model. It's most often 2 to 3 days a week. Those 2 to 3 days are Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and some combination. A couple interesting ramifications I'm curious your perspective on. One, from a real estate perspective, what are the implications in terms of how companies think about investing in real estate when, it used to be you had people maybe spread out across 5 days a week. Now you have people condensed maybe into 3 days a week. Pricing impact of that should be pretty significant in terms of the way people think about the value that they get out of that part of their P&L, so to speak.
Yeah, so totally. So let's break down, take a typical office. Living in the typical office, there were not that many in-person employees. So a typical office was probably about 20% of people that are now gone fully remote. Think of all, payroll, HR, benefits, IT support, chunks of that. And then the other 80% of people that are inhabited a pre-pandemic office are probably now hybrid. So on the 20% that have gone fully remote, that is space is saved permanently. So that's partly why office demand is down. Or the folks that did payroll, they're just not there anymore and they're not coming back. So that's a one-off immediate space saving. The trickier thing is dealing with the hybrid employees. Probably most listeners, most university graduates in America are hybrid. Now, if your model is they come in 1 day a week, it probably does not make sense to have an office for them. It's going to be cheaper just to, pay for WeWork or whatever it is, or flex space, to figure that out. If they're coming in probably 2 or certainly 3+ days a week, you do want office space. Now, there's various ways around it. I mean, Scoop has desk scheduling software. You can try and schedule it. That's helpful for saving space. There's some upsides on that. The downsides are, maybe if you want all teams on at the same time, you maybe don't have them scheduled, you just have them coming in. When I talk to companies, it seems to be a choice by choice. So some companies, like for example, Stanford, we are letting each group choose its days. They don't all choose exactly the same days, so we're saving a bit of space. Other companies are saying, look, we just want everyone in on Tuesday to Thursday. So we want the whole team there, the whole firm there. They're not saving any space. In some ways, it seems extreme. So a bunch of CEOs and real estate people have said, this is terrible. We're not saving space. But on the other hand, it's not that different from 2019. So if you go back to 2019, there are 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. So that's 168 hours a week. We typically only are in the office for about 50 of them. So pre-pandemic, you only used, 30% of office time, roughly. We've now gone from 30% down to 20%. So yes, it's even more wasteful, but on the other hand, it's just a classic peak loading problem. So I think offices will be smaller. Commercial real estate, as in the office buildings, the demand for that has dropped, particularly lower quality ones. Higher quality, class A offices in city centers, because people want to be hybrid and those kind of things. They're going to do okay. It will be soft for the next, 5-6 years, but eventually it's not like people are going to go away. They'll just be a bit less space.
I think there's also going to have to be some interesting innovation or thought process around when meetings happen too, right? Because if most folks end up in the office, if you're hybrid, and if you're hybrid most of the time, you end up sometime in the Tuesday, Wednesday to Thursday range, as you're describing, and everyone tries to load up all of their meetings on Tuesday, Wednesday to Thursday for the week, then I feel like there's some risk that you're going to have this terrible meeting overload where everybody goes in, they're wall to wall from 9 to 5 in meetings, basically. And then spend all either late hours or early mornings or Monday to Friday just trying to dig out of what that experience is like. I wonder what the trade-off is there versus having some folks in on Monday, some folks in on Tuesday, letting teams actually figure that out a little bit. And maybe that creates a bit more spread in some of the activities that happen as well.
Yes, I think that's a choice thing. So partly it's how, imagine you have teams A, B, C, and D, just to keep it, basic. If they all interact with each other, they probably need to be on the same days. Look, if they're all, if each one of them, A interacts with D, B interacts with D, C interacts with D, maybe D just is the only one that needs to overlap and the others can stagger. So it depends on the structure of companies. It also depends on what people want. So if you ask most employees, would you rather have 3 crushingly social days where it's like meeting after meeting, but you get to work from home for 2 days a week? Most people will probably go with that. It's funny, as a professor, you have teaching, and it's the same choice for teaching. Do you put all your teaching into one quarter on, certain days, and you've done 6 hours of teaching, you're absolutely exhausted, or do you spread it out? And typically, people concentrate because it leaves you free to travel on to go give it. If I get invited by MIT to give a talk, I don't want to say no because I've got teaching, the next day. So I think it will be a choice thing. The other thing I've heard a lot about is being smart about booking space because of, as you said, overload of meeting rooms. So it's partly having them booked, but partly being clever about how you use the space. So one company I spoke to is providing those sensors, motion sensors in the corners of rooms, and discovering a lot of big rooms are full of just one person on a Zoom call. So what you really need is partly some kind of little cubicles that people can Zoom on and a booking system. So if it's just one person, you should just be in a small cube. If it's 8 of you, you need the bigger room. And it's, a combination of physical layout, designing it, but also the software to book across this.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. So let's step away from hybrid for a second. One thing I'm curious to hear, I imagine a lot of people feel very strongly about this question, but if you had to look forward to 2030, what do you think is going to be higher frequency in the population in terms of a work type? Do you think there are going to be more people, and maybe to caveat, to clarify, I'm talking more about like kind of like corporate desk-based and workers. Do you think a higher percentage of them are going to be fully on site or fully remote?
I think hybrid is going to be the big one that's going to grow.
If you strip out hybrid, so let's say the majority are hybrid, do you think fully on site is larger as a kind of a sliver, or do you think fully remote is larger as a sliver in terms of what remains?
So I do my thinking, and I'm not sure, it's a race. It's hard to compare two hypothetical, well, there are two kind of trends, but to go through it. So fully in person is slowly ebbing away because of technology. So just an anecdote, across the road for me is, my neighbor is a doctor, and she was saying pre-pandemic, she's in every day. Now she works from home 1 day a week and does telemedicine. And a lot of patients want it. She wants it, it's like follow up on tests. It's, short business, etc. I can easily see that growing a lot across a lot of other things. There's many activities. I actually spoke to Satya Nadella, it's interesting, from Microsoft about the Microsoft stores. And he said one of the things they were seeing is more purchasing online. But when people buy Microsoft equipment online, they still want to talk to somebody. So some of the folks working in the retail stores, which you think was like the hardest thing to ever do remotely, is now happening 1 day a week, because those folks that are in store Monday to Thursday are told, say on Friday, you can go and do the home-based version and talk to online customers. So the fully in-person people, that group is going to be slowly shrinking as technology makes those jobs easier to do, hybrid. The fully remote has the other, technology shrinking that group because of AI and offshoring. Which shrinks faster is less obvious. I'll give you right now, fully in-person is 60% of Americans and fully remote is 10%. So fully in-person is massively bigger. Although those folks don't tend to be in offices. They tend to be in retail, manufacturing, healthcare, education, etc. So if you were just to pick on offices, there I think it's more balanced.
Yeah, that'll be a fun one for us to revisit over time and see how the speed at which they're moving. One last kind of prediction question for you about hybrid. Right now we talk a lot about the average, I think, days you have in the WFH research. I think it's somewhere between 2 and 3, if I recall correct.
Yeah.
Our Flex Index data is 2.5 right now in terms of days in office. Where do you think that's going to go over the next 5 years? Do you think it's going to stay flat, move up, move down in terms of amount of time on average spent in office for hybrid folks?
I don't think it will shift dramatically. There are two reasons for this. So first, if you survey employees what they want, which is a pretty good starting point, they actually on average want to come into work about 2.5 days a week. So people, me included, I like going in. It's like, it's nice today. I bumped into a bunch of folks and it's social and it's, invigorating, but I also like avoiding the commute and being at home. And 2-3 days a week for the typical Americans about right. If you then look at employers, there's a given amount, there's something in economics called the task-based model. So you think of all the tasks you do throughout the week. And for employers, you can think about splitting what, your workers do into things that are best done in person. So mentoring, maybe creativity meetings, and things that are best done maybe remotely, reading, writing, deep work, concentration work. If you look, that's roughly 50-50. Again, it varies, but a lot of organizations, it's roughly half-half. So I think 2.5 days a week is pretty stable. There are trends right now. You hear from some firms saying managers are getting tough. They're telling employees, look, the economy's turning down. You got to come back in. We're going to give you, unless you do that, you should say goodbye to your job. That's true. But on the other hand, I'm also hearing from firms that saying if there's a recession, I'm going to get rid of my office because there's one way to cut costs. So in the aggregate data, as you mentioned, the Castle data, the Sway data, the census data, all three of them, we see actually days work from home or days in the office, which is kind of the inverse of that. It's just flatline. So I think 2.5 days a week is roughly here to stay. And that tells you, that matches up with my hearing that the most common pattern is 3, but it's not always perfectly enforced.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And it's interesting. I tend to believe that where you've got alignment between what employees are pushing for and what ends up saving money to companies is generally something with staying power. And it feels like that's a pretty good equilibrium around that topic.
Exactly.
Maybe one last prediction question. It may be a little bit of a harder one. What's something that you believe to be true or is going to become true that maybe most people either would disagree with or haven't thought about really yet when it comes to the future work?
I'm not sure how shocking it is, but I think I keep having to emphasize is what I call the Nike swoosh of work from home. So I keep getting asked, oh, work from home is declining. Bosses are being tough. They're dragging people back. It's over. So not only is that petering out, but I've been saying for a while now, if you look at the longer run, so I'm thinking 2025, 2030, it's going to be up. And why is that? Well, that's what's called market size effects in economics. It's like one of the first things you learn in undergrad economics is, look, if there's a market that's got a lot bigger, firms innovate to service that market. And a good example of that is a market for work from home hardware and software. Scoop's a good example. That pre-pandemic, 5% of days will work from home. Post-pandemic is 25%. That market's gone up fivefold. So every hardware and software company out there is rapidly developing new technologies. That's feeding through. And that will mean in 2025, 2030, the tech that we'll be using will be so much better. And it's tech that really drives all of it. So by 2030, it could easily be holograms, massive screens, multiple cameras over the screen. So whenever you look at any part of the screen, it appears you're making eye contact. Really fast connectivity. It's hard for me to predict what it is actually, but we'll look back at 2023 and think, did we really have all these calls on these little laptops with one camera sat at the top of the screen with, connectivity flaking in and out, etc. And, it's amazing how much better things are now. So I would predict by 25 and certainly by 27, 28, we'll have higher levels of work from home than we do now. So sure, if this is this Nike swoosh, in the short run, it will drop maybe a little bit, not much, but long run, it's going to be up. And if I was the CEO, CFO, CHR planning, I would plan for that. So we have reached kind of, peak return to office. And if anything, we're heading back out again, back to more work from home.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And it makes a lot of sense. I want to go deeper on that one topic for a second around the technology, because I think you're right. Like, it's one of the things I say quite often is the experience of work from home, at least the hybrid and the way that hybrid is kind of evolved, is unlike most other markets where you have early adopters and laggards, and it might take place over 5, 10, 20 years. This experience for a lot of companies kind of happened overnight. And so you're really, really early in the cycle still relative to the number of employees and employers that are experiencing it. And to your point, that's going to cause a rush of investment, drive technology improvements. And you gave an example of better eye contact. I imagine a number of investments will get made, hardware and software, to make you feel like you can have more effective meetings when you're not in the same room together, or can connect better emotionally with folks. And one of the things I saw recently, and I think you and I have talked about a little bit, is, Jamie Dimon, I think, came out maybe not too long ago and said he thinks remote work slows down honesty in decision-making, And one of the things I'm curious about is, one, do you think that's true, just based on what you've seen and the way you've talked to companies? And two, is that really a short-term way of thinking about the experience relative to what you just described in 3, 5, 7 years, and how technology will improve to make it that you can have better, more immersive conversations when not in the same room as somebody else?
On honesty, I've heard this kicked around, and I'll give you one in a minute. I'll go to one really high-profile anecdote. Before I go there, I think it's possible this is only based on introspection, to be honest. So I don't have any hard data on it, but my experience just over my career is when you have a sensitive topic, it is a little easier to talk to people face to face. If you're in a big meeting of folks and you're not sure which way the wind's blowing, it is slightly easier maybe after the meeting's over to walk over to somebody and say, hey, Sarah, hey, Rob, I'm not sure I agreed with that. What do you think? Kind of sound them out a bit. And the anecdote I have that's been in the media a bit, in fact, I was quoted, I was trying to be very careful about, I don't have evidence, is Silicon Valley Bank. So Silicon Valley Bank, if you look at what basically caused its downfall, it was some unwise investments in 2021. So I won't go through the details, but by the beginning of 2022, their fate was sealed. And that was an era they were entirely remote. Now, what they did is, they basically parked all their money in treasuries and prayed that those things wouldn't drop if interest rates run up quickly. It turns out they did, and they were basically became insolvent. Now, there must have been people at SVB who were aware of this. This wasn't a particularly complicated issue. So my wondering is, for Silicon Valley Bank, when they had their management meetings, was it the case there were 2 or 3 people who were nervous what's going on because it was all on Zoom, and one person is Hawaii, one's in New York, they never met in person? Did they not feel like they could raise it, or did they raise it and it got crushed on Zoom and it never went on? I don't know. I have no data or evidence on that, but I have heard from people that they find it a little easier, particularly difficult conversations. So it doesn't mean we've got to be fully in person by all means, but it does mean I think hybrid is probably here to stay for a while until the technology is so amazing. If you go to Star Wars, where, the Jedi Council is all standing around in holograms, maybe when you get...
And even that doesn't look that good, by the way, in Star Wars, the hologram.
Yeah, exactly. They're flickering in and out all the time. And, they do often meet in person. So even in Star Wars, they feel like they can't be fully remote. So it's hard to predict, 20 years out. But I think while it's the case that in person has benefits over, feels like more real, we will have some amount of that. The other thing I've heard is decision-making speed. So actually, I spoke to David Solomon at Goldman's, and Jamie Dimon made the same comment, actually. It can be faster to make decisions when you're in person because everything iterates back and forward. For many businesses, decision-making speed isn't important. I mean, look, if you're Goldman's and you're trading, milliseconds matters. But for most, I'm at Stanford, it doesn't matter whether I make a decision in 1 or 2 seconds, nothing. I'd rather make the right decision and take a minute than the wrong one and take 5 seconds. But for some organizations, high speed matters. And in that case, it may also, for the next few years at least, be better to be in person, and the technology gets so good you can do things.
Yeah, the one thing that I always struggle with on this topic, and look, every company is a little bit different, is companies have had global management teams for decades, right? And are very used to having the New York office talk to the San Francisco office, talk to the London office, and have executive meetings that happen remotely and then get together in person at particular times a year. I used to work at Bain. Partners were spread out around the globe, and they would get together for annual meetings, for example. And so lots and lots of companies have managed to be successful and make good decisions without having to be in person all the time, right? And so while I get and believe that there's certainly certain types of conversations that are easier to have or better to have in person or faster, I feel like there's plenty of examples too of companies doing just fine at being able to do this largely remotely, although still needing to get together from time to time, to be able to have certain types of conversations or events or relationship building and that kind of stuff.
Sure, totally. So this is all about trade-offs. I mean, I'm aligned with you that what's stuck is what makes companies money. So many people see work from home as a social movement, and I kind of agree with that. I'm a big supporter of it. But ultimately, the reason it was stick and it's been so successful is it's just more profitable. And the biggest single driver of that is in our data. And everyone sees us in flesh, is that people value the ability to work from home 2-3 days a week about the same as an 8% pay increase. So you present this to firms, they're aware of it. And it also doesn't seem like 2 or 3 days a week has any negative effects on productivity. In fact, it's positive. So I think hybrid is here to stay because it's just more profitable. Whether you can go from hybrid to fully remote, I think depends on the trade-off of how much employees value it, as in how much you can adjust their pay versus, the impact, positive or negative, on productivity. And I don't think there is one size fits all, actually. Coming back to our earlier discussion, there are some firms that will be very successful fully remote, others that are hybrid. So yeah, it's a case by case, but the typical US firm will have senior managers, CEO, etc., hybrid, a few support staff and folks like that fully remote, and then probably quite a large number of people that are fully in person, that are frontline service, security, cleaning, etc., food service.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. This is great. Any other thoughts on this topic before we move on, or we covered it well?
The other thought for me that maybe I should have seen this coming is been such a long process. So, I started collecting data and doing a lot of discussion, early, back to March, April 2020. And I kept thinking, it's like one of those horror movies where, maybe the thing never dies. But I kept thinking, well, this thing's going to be over. We're going to figure it out. And we're now more than 3 years into the pandemic. There's still a lot of discussion in the media. It shows us how hard it is. So when I talk to managers, if they're struggling and finding it difficult, it is a genuinely really challenging thing. And the reason is, this is the biggest change to hit US labor markets probably since World War II. So in World War II, there's a big increase in female labor force participation, which is great. Men went off to fight. Women, worked in much higher numbers, and it turned out that was very successful and it stuck. But that really radically changed society. And this is probably the next big step that has changed, the working lives of roughly half of Americans. So it's hard to deal with it. And we are norming out. I'd say now we're kind of stabilizing at the macro level. Levels of work from home are flattened out, but at the micro level, there's still a lot of turbulence. It's like the duck, smooth on the surface and frantically paddling underneath.
Totally. It'll be interesting to see how it continues to evolve over the coming years. I know there's still I'm always shocked when I see the data on the percentage of firms that still have not clearly articulated a policy to their employees on exactly what the expectation is or what hybrid's going to look like. And so I think there's still going to be a little bit of concrete hardening over the coming years as companies iterate and think through this. Nick, this has been awesome. One thing that we always do with every guest before we wrap is I'd love to ask you just a bunch of different, very quick rapid fire questions. So like 10 seconds or less, just so folks can get to know you a little bit more. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, great.
All right, cool. All right, so first question, what was your very first job?
A summer intern. I think the first paid job I had was a summer internship with an accounting firm that's long since merged like 27 times up, but counting boxes in storehouses to, check up with companies' account.
And what was your very first unpaid job? Do you remember that one?
Yeah, I had a side internship. To be honest, I'm 50, so, this is a long time ago, 35 years ago, but my mom worked in the UK civil service and got me some unpaid job as a friend of a friend. It was good. I mean, it was a good job. It's kind of interesting. But yeah, that was even before then.
Cool. And what is the best book you've read lately?
Geez, I'm embarrassed to say you know what? It's going to be a kid's book. I've been reading a lot with my daughter, so it's embarrassing. I've been reading a lot of David Walliams. So that's not an adult book, but I tend to be a voracious reader of like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, BBC, Economist, Bloomberg, BI, etc. I don't get a lot of economics papers, the kind of things that would put pretty much anyone to sleep. But yeah, probably that. I'm actually reading All for Auntie by David Walliams right now, so that's probably all I should give you.
I totally understand. I think I have a 20-month-old, as you know. I think I've probably read Moo Ba La La more than I've read any other book in my life, over the last year and a half. When you're in meetings, do you typically like to have, or video conference meetings, do you typically like to have camera on or camera off?
Camera on, for sure. Actually, I put something out. It's part of our exec pack. We survey 5,000 people, Americans, and asked them, A, do you pay more attention when your camera's on? And B, do you think other people pay more attention? In both cases, very symmetrically, the answer is basically yes. So I get if it's a 50-person meeting, that's kind of a different setup. But look, if it's, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And in fact, when I talk to execs, senior managers get very frustrated about this. They're like, you can tell. They said, I was talking to something the other day, it was the managing partner for a big law firm. They said, you can completely tell if the camera's on or off, that the person, if they're off and it's muted. In fact, someone else told me a fantastic story. There's someone who's in a meeting with the camera off and muted, and they're like butt pressed, they unmute, and you could hear the sound of someone saying like, I think it's at least 2 shots to the fairway, to the green. It was like clear that they were basically taking this from the guy, and then it unmuted again. It was like, okay, we know what you're up to.
It just confirmed all of the worst suspicions. It's too funny. What is a show or a movie that you are obsessed with right now?
A show or movie that I'm obsessed with right now. Trying to think of a movie. Geez, I watch a lot of terrible TV shows. I was actually going to go watch a movie tonight. What's the last movie I watched? Oh God, this is an easy question. This is kind of thing that it's like when you ask prime ministers, in Britain, one of these gotcha questions is, what's the price of a pint of milk? And they always flub that because I haven't bought a bottle of milk for like 20 years. I watched Dune. To be honest, I'm very much looking forward to seeing the next Dune come up. I watched a lot of science fiction films. TV show. I like The Crown. That's been great. I wouldn't mind, that I think I've learned a lot of my British history off that. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, it's great. I love Dune also, by the way. I'm a big science fiction buff, so I thought that was awesome.
The book was great. It's one of the few times where the movie's done justice to the book, actually.
Yeah, incredibly difficult, but it's such good source material, right? It's great content. Favorite snack when you're in the office?
Favorite snack when I'm in the office? I'm not in the office that much, but favorite snack, I eat a lot of rubbishy, snack. Those fig bars, a lot of these peanut butter bars. I wouldn't say they're particularly healthy, but maybe I'm not in the office very much, so maybe I don't need it.
All right, just 2 more. What is your favorite piece of flexible work software?
Probably Zoom. Zoom is I've actually met Eric Yuan 2-3 times, so it's not entirely why, but it's just loads fast. It works well. Oddly enough, you can shrink the screen so it sits next to my camera. There's a bunch of that. I mean, Teams is great, WebEx is great, but Zoom is my favorite.
Got it. And last one, who is a future of work thinker that you really respect?
Matt Kahn, Ed Glazer, there's a whole bunch of folks that I get embarrassed now. I go back and think of all the people I follow. But there's a huge number of people. If you go to my Twitter and LinkedIn, you can see all the key things that I follow, actually.
Awesome. Okay. And one last final question for our listeners. If people want to learn more about you or read more about your research, where should they go?
Probably wfhresearch.com, or just follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter. I put the same thing out. I'm increasingly been migrating to LinkedIn, actually. It seems like the world is migrating to LinkedIn off Twitter, but yeah, I put it out on both, so whichever's easiest.
Awesome. Nick, it is always a pleasure. I find your thinking on this topic and your research so insightful. So thank you very much for spending the time with me.
Hey, thanks very much, Rob.
All right, take care. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please also consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that helps other listeners find the podcast. For more FlexIndex content, including past episodes, our FlexIndex newsletter, and monthly research reports, visit flex.scoopforwork.com. See you next time.